Hey guys, thanks for joining me. On our journey through the Bible, we are up to the book of Numbers. So, let's jump in and answer our 8 questions. So, the first question is who wrote the book of Numbers? And again, that would be Moses. Moses wrote the first 5 books of the New Testament. So, now let's answer the question who was it written to? And it was written to everyone. And we have internal evidence to prove that Numbers was recorded for everyone that's ever lived on the face of the earth. And internal evidence is verses in other places in the Bible that prove that to be true. So as we move along, we're going to look at that internal evidence to prove that Numbers was written for us also. So now let's answer the question, how much time was covered? Based on my study, it looks to be about 39 years is covered during the book of Numbers. So now let's think about the main idea of the book of Numbers. So the book opens and closes with the numbering or the counting of all the fighting men within the 12 tribes. And it's time to enter the promised land. They have reached the border, and it's time to go in and take it. So they send 12 spies to go in and spy out the land, but 10 come back with a very negative report. They don't believe that they can take it. They don't believe what God has said. But 2 spies did come back with a good report, and that would be Joshua and Caleb. But God is greatly displeased with the bad report that the 10 gave, and that the nation chose to side themselves with the 10 that gave the bad report. So God gives the punishment that anyone that's 20 years old and up will die in the wilderness, and there will be a time of 40 years of wandering in the wilderness. So some notable characters found within the book of Numbers is God, Moses, Aaron, and Miriam. Now, those 3 were siblings, Moses and Aaron and Miriam. Those are brothers and sisters. The 12 spies, and we don't really know much about them except Joshua and Caleb, who were the 2 spies that brought back the good report. And then also you have Korah and Balak and Balaam are also some notable characters found within the book of Numbers. So some notable events within the book of Numbers. We've already mentioned the 2 numberings of the fighting men at the beginning of the book and at the end of the book. And the reason there's 2 is because you have that time where everybody 20 years old and upward dies. So you have a new generation at the end of Numbers, so they need to number them again since that generation died. You have multiple times of people complaining, the 12 spies going into the promised land to spy it out, the punishment of 40 years of wandering, everybody 20 years old and up dying in the wilderness, Korah's rebellion, Aaron's staff buds, Miriam dies during the book of Numbers, Moses disobeys God and receives the punishment that he will not get to enter the promised land, Aaron dies, the bronze serpent, Balaam's donkey speaks, and then you had idol worship to an idol called Baal, and 24,000 people die as a result of that. So those are just some of the notable events you find within the book of Numbers. So now let's answer the question, where on the timeline does the book of Numbers fall? And that would be the wilderness wandering. And it's mainly the 2nd year of the wandering and the 40th year. So in between that time, there's not a lot going on because they're just wandering. Some people think that maybe Moses penned Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, and parts of Numbers during that wandering, because that would have been a lot of downtime. So now let's think about Jesus within the book of Numbers, because remember, Jesus is all throughout the Bible. The whole Bible is about Jesus. It points, the Old Testament points to the cross, and then the letters point back to the cross. So in Numbers 21, we find the account of the fiery serpents. So Numbers 21, and I'm going to read part of that, starting in verse number 4. From Mount Hor, they set out by the way to the Red Sea to go around the land of Edom. And the people became impatient on the way. And the people spoke against God and spoke against Moses. And this is what the people said. Why have you brought us up out of Egypt to die in the wilderness? For there is no food and no water, and we loathe this worthless food. So the worthless food that they mention in here is the manna that God had given them every morning. One thing they had to do was go out and gather it. So it's not like they're having to really labor for their food, but they are being so disrespectful toward that and just have a really negative, grumbling attitude. And God is greatly displeased because they've challenged his authority and because they've grumbled. So here's the consequence. Then the Lord sent fiery serpents among the people, and they bit the people, so that many of the people of Israel died. And the people came to Moses and said, "We have sinned, for we have spoken against the Lord and against you. Pray to the Lord that he may take away the serpents from us." So the Lord prayed for the people, and the Lord said to Moses, "Make a fiery serpent and set it on a pole, and anyone who is bitten when he sees it shall live." So Moses made a bronze serpent and set it on a pole, and if the serpent bit anyone, then he should look on the bronze serpent and live. So then in John, the Gospel of John, in chapter 3, we have Jesus himself making a reference back to the fiery serpent. So this is found in John chapter 3, verse 14. And the context is Nicodemus comes to Jesus at night and they're having this long discourse. And it's in the middle of this discourse that Jesus says in verse 14 of John 3. And as Moses lifted up the serpent in the wilderness, so must the Son of Man be lifted up. And whoever believes in him may have eternal life. So now the last thing we're going to answer is, why even study the book of Numbers? Well, I would submit to you that there's several examples of people challenging God's authority, and there were big consequences. You can read about Korah. When he challenged God's authority, the earth just opened up and swallowed him alive, him and all his family. Moses striking the rock instead of speaking to it, and his consequence is he doesn't get to enter the promised land. There's several examples of lack of faith and lack of obedience that had big consequences. So as we wander in our wilderness, so remember we said figuratively here on earth, that's our time of wilderness wandering, and we're looking forward to our promised land, which is heaven. We really need to remember not to challenge God's authority, not to practice idolatry, not to have anything else above God, and certainly not to grumble about things that God has given us, just blessings that he gives us. And the internal evidence that I spoke of earlier is found in 1 Corinthians chapter 10. And again, this is a rather long reading, but I think it's going to tie everything together to show you how studying the Old Testament can really be beneficial, because these examples that he talks about come from Exodus that we looked at a couple of weeks ago, and most of them come from Numbers, the book of consideration today. So this is 1 Corinthians 10, and I'll be reading from the ESV version. "For I do not want you to be unaware, brothers, that our fathers were all under the cloud, and all passed through the sea, and all were baptized into Moses in the cloud and the sea, and all ate the same spiritual food, and all drank the same spiritual drink. For they drank from the spiritual rock that followed them, and the rock was Christ. Nevertheless, with most of them God was not pleased, for they were overthrown in the wilderness. Now these things took place as an example for us, that we might not desire evil as they did. Do not be idolaters, as some of them were, as it is written, the people sat down to eat and drink and rose up to play. We must not indulge in sexual immorality, as some of them did. And 23,000 fell in a single day. We must not put Christ to the test, as some of them did and were destroyed by the serpents. Nor grumble, as some of them did and were destroyed by the destroyer. Now these things happened to them as an example, but they were written down for our instruction." So there we have internal evidence that Numbers was written for everyone. Those things were written as an example to us to not to practice idolatry, not to challenge God's authority, and not to grumble about blessings that he gives us every day. I hope this study's been helpful, and I hope it encourages you to look at Numbers at some point and see what you can glean, lessons you can glean. So next week we will finish up the Pentateuch with the book of Deuteronomy. Y'all have a great week.